Ma'am, you don't belong here. The sentence landed flat but heavy, cutting through the low hum of the private jet's cabin as if someone had turned the air colder by 10 degrees. Naomi Carter didn't flinch. Her hand rested on the edge of a cream-colored leather seat, fingers tracing the fine stitching like she was memorizing it, grounding herself in something real while the world around her tried to push her out of place. The overhead lights cast a soft gold glow across polished wood panels and chrome finishes, reflecting off the narrow aisle where 3 uniformed crew members now stood in a quiet line, blocking her path forward. Their posture wasn't aggressive, but it didn't need to be. It was practiced, controlled, certain. Ethan Brooks stood at the center, tablet in hand, eyes scanning the passenger manifest with the kind of precision that left no room for error or exceptions. "Your name isn't on this list," he said, voice calm, almost polite, but firm enough to draw a line no one was supposed to cross. A few seats back, a man in a tailored navy suit paused mid-sip of his drink, watching over the rim of his glass. Another passenger shifted slightly, angling their phone just enough to capture what might become something worth sharing later. Naomi noticed everything. The glances, the silence, the assumption. But she didn't move, didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, her reflection faintly visible in the oval window beside her, the runway lights blinking in slow, distant patterns outside like a heartbeat waiting to be heard. "I'll ask you one more time," Ethan continued, taking a small step closer, lowering his voice as if that made it more reasonable. "Please step off the aircraft." The word please hung there, thin and hollow. Naomi's gaze dropped briefly to the tablet in his hands, then lifted again, steady, unreadable. "Who approved this manifest?" she asked quietly. The question didn't sound defensive. It sounded precise, intentional, and it didn't land where Ethan expected it to. His expression tightened, just slightly, like something small but important had slipped out of alignment. Behind him, one of the crew members exchanged a quick glance with another, uncertainty flickering for a fraction of a second before discipline snapped back into place. The engines outside let out a distant whir, low and constant, vibrating faintly through the cabin floor beneath Naomi's feet. No one spoke for a moment. Then footsteps approached from the front of the jet, measured, confident, unmistakable. The captain appeared at the edge of the aisle, eyes moving from Ethan to Naomi in a single sweep that seemed to take in more than just what was visible. Naomi didn't turn to face him. She didn't need to. Her voice came again, calm as ever, directed forward but meant for everyone. "Why is my crew trying to remove me from my own aircraft?" The words settled into the space like weight, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the silence that followed wasn't controlled, it was absolute. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like pressure inside a sealed room slowly finding a crack. Ethan Brooks did not step back, but something in his posture lost its sharpness, like a line drawn too confidently now being questioned. The tablet in his hand lowered by an inch, then another, his eyes flicking toward the captain as if waiting for confirmation that this was still under control. The captain did not speak immediately. He stood there, one hand resting lightly against the side panel, gaze fixed on Naomi with a focus that was no longer casual, no longer routine. Naomi remained where she was, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, her reflection in the oval window now clearer as the outside lights brightened along the runway. The soft glow traced the outline of her face, calm and composed, untouched by the tension surrounding her. Behind Ethan, one of the crew members shifted their weight, the faint creak of the cabin floor echoing louder than it should have. A passenger cleared his throat quietly, then stopped, as if even that small sound felt inappropriate now. Everything seemed to wait. Ethan tried again, his voice lower, more controlled, but missing the certainty it carried moments ago. "Ma'am, if there is a misunderstanding, we can resolve it off the aircraft." The phrasing had changed. The command was gone. In its place was something closer to negotiation. Naomi did not look at him. Her attention stayed forward, toward the captain, toward the space where authority actually mattered. "There is no misunderstanding," she said, her tone even, almost gentle, but anchored in something that did not move. The captain exhaled slowly, a quiet breath that carried weight. His eyes dropped briefly to the polished floor, then returned to Naomi, and in that small motion, something unspoken passed between them, recognition, alignment, something that did not need to be explained out loud. Ethan noticed it. He straightened slightly, tension returning, but this time it felt defensive, not dominant. "Captain," he said, a hint of urgency slipping through. "We have a schedule to maintain." The words sounded smaller than intended. The captain finally turned his head toward Ethan, not abruptly, but with deliberate control. "We do," he replied, voice measured, calm, but carrying a depth that settled the space instantly. Then he looked back at Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said, using her name without hesitation, "I was not informed you would be boarding personally today." The sentence landed softly, but its meaning rippled outward, touching every person in the cabin. Ethan froze. The crew behind him stilled completely. Even the passenger with the raised phone lowered it slightly, as if instinctively recognizing a line had just been crossed and corrected. Naomi gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "Plans changed," she said. The captain inclined his head once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not surprise. The balance had shifted now, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the tablet, his mind catching up to the reality unfolding in front of him. The list in his hand, the rules he followed, the authority he believed in, none of it accounted for this. The cabin felt different now, the air no longer pressing in the same direction. Naomi stepped forward, just one step, not to challenge, not to assert, but simply to move where she had intended to be all along. No one blocked her this time. The shift did not come with noise, but with space. The narrow aisle that had felt closed moments ago now seemed to open on its own, as if the aircraft itself had corrected a mistake no one wanted to admit. Naomi Carter moved forward at an unhurried pace, her steps quiet against the polished floor, each one measured, unforced, completely natural. She did not look at Ethan as she passed him. She did not need to. The weight of what had just been revealed lingered in the air between them, heavier than any words either of them could offer now. Ethan remained where he stood, shoulders squared but no longer leading, his attention fixed on the space Naomi had just occupied, as if trying to understand how something so certain had slipped past him so completely. The tablet in his hand dimmed slightly, the screen reflecting his own expression back at him, tight, uncertain, unfamiliar. Behind him, the rest of the crew adjusted without speaking, their formation breaking subtly as they stepped aside, creating a path that should have been there from the beginning. Naomi reached the center of the cabin and paused briefly beside a wide seat near the window, her fingers brushing the headrest, not possessive, not performative, just present. Outside, the runway lights stretched into the distance in clean, parallel lines, a quiet reminder of direction, of control, of movement waiting to happen. The captain stepped forward, his presence steady, composed, but now clearly aligned with her. "We are ready for departure at your discretion," he said, his tone respectful, direct, stripped of any formality that did not belong. The words settled into the cabin, reshaping it. A passenger in the back leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed not in suspicion now, but in realization, as if replaying the last few minutes and finding a completely different story than the one they thought they were watching. Another quietly lowered their phone all the way, no longer interested in recording, because the moment had already passed into something more than spectacle. Naomi took her seat without urgency, smoothing the front of her jacket with a small, practiced motion, then resting her hands lightly in her lap. She exhaled once slow and controlled, the kind of breath that did not release tension but acknowledged it. Ethan finally moved, one step forward, then another, stopping just short of where he might have spoken. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, stripped of the authority he had relied on, but not empty. "Ms. Carter," he said, the name careful now, deliberate. "There was no indication in the system that you would be on board." It was not quite an apology. Not yet. But it was no longer a command. Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, but no longer distant. "That is the problem," she replied, her voice even, carrying just far enough for him to hear, and for the silence behind him to understand. The statement lingered, simple but exact, pointing not at a mistake of presence, but at something deeper, something built into the way decisions were made, lists were trusted, and people were seen or overlooked. Ethan absorbed it without response, his gaze lowering for a brief second before returning, not to challenge, but to listen. The engines outside grew louder now, a rising hum that filled the cabin with a steady vibration, grounding everything in motion again. The crew resumed their positions, movements precise but quieter, more aware, as if every action now carried a different weight. Naomi looked out the window, watching the lights blur slightly as the aircraft prepared to move, her reflection steady against the glass, unchanged by what had just unfolded. And in that reflection, the cabin behind her no longer looked the same. The aircraft began to move with a slow, deliberate roll, the subtle pushback pressing gently into every seat as the outside world started to glide past the oval windows in smooth, silent motion. Inside the cabin, everything appeared normal again on the surface. Seat belts clicked into place, overhead lights dimmed slightly, and the crew resumed their duties with practiced precision. But the atmosphere had not returned to what it was before. It had changed shape. Naomi Carter sat still, her gaze resting on the runway lights as they stretched and blurred into long golden lines, her reflection steady in the glass, composed and distant, yet fully present. Across the aisle, Ethan Brooks stood near the service station, his hands resting lightly against the counter, fingers still, eyes unfocused for a moment, as if recalibrating something deeper than a schedule or a checklist. He had spent years trusting systems, manifests, procedures that left no room for doubt, and yet within a matter of minutes, all of that certainty had fractured in a way he could not easily explain. He glanced toward Naomi again, but this time there was no assumption in his look, no quiet judgment, only awareness, and something closer to restraint. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured, announcing their taxi clearance, his tone carrying a subtle shift that only those paying close attention would notice, a tone that now acknowledged a presence beyond routine authority. A passenger seated 2 rows behind Naomi leaned forward slightly, speaking in a low voice to the person beside him, but whatever he said stopped halfway, as if the need to comment no longer felt appropriate. The cabin had become quieter than necessary, not out of tension now, but out of recognition. Naomi adjusted her seat slightly, the soft leather responding with a faint sound, her hand resting along the armrest, fingers relaxed, her posture unchanged from the moment she first stepped inside. She did not look back at Ethan, did not seek acknowledgement, did not demand anything further. She simply existed within the space that had always been hers, long before anyone questioned it. Ethan finally stepped away from the service station, moving down the aisle with controlled steps until he reached her row. He stopped at a respectful distance, not blocking her view, not drawing attention, just present. For a brief second, he hesitated, as if choosing his words with care rather than confidence. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice lower now, steady but no longer authoritative. "Your flight preferences were not updated in our system. That should not have happened." It was a statement of fact, but beneath it, something else was forming, an acknowledgement that went beyond logistics. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time since taking her seat. Her expression remained calm, but there was a quiet clarity in her eyes, something that did not accuse, but did not excuse either. "Systems only reflect what people choose to see," she said, her tone even, unhurried, each word landing with quiet precision. The statement lingered between them, simple on the surface, but layered with meaning that extended far beyond a missing name on a list. Ethan absorbed it in silence, his posture shifting subtly, not in defeat, but in understanding that he had not been looking in the right direction to begin with. The engines grew louder as the aircraft aligned with the runway, the steady hum building into a force that filled the cabin with vibration, grounding every passenger in the moment before acceleration. Naomi turned her attention back to the window, watching the horizon line steady itself ahead, her reflection merging with the darkness outside. Behind her, the cabin remained quiet, not because nothing had happened, but because something had, and no one needed to speak to feel it. The aircraft paused at the edge of the runway, engines humming low and steady, like a breath held just before release. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting softer shadows across the leather seats and polished surfaces, turning every reflection into something deeper, more introspective. Naomi Carter remained still, her gaze fixed ahead now instead of the window, her posture unchanged, grounded, as if she had already moved past the moment that had unsettled everyone else. Around her, small movements resumed, a seat belt adjusted, a jacket sleeve smoothed, a quiet shift in posture from one passenger to another, but none of it returned the space to what it had been. The silence carried memory. Ethan Brooks stood near the galley, his hands now clasped loosely in front of him, no longer holding the tablet that had once defined his authority. It rested behind him on the counter, its screen dark, irrelevant. His eyes moved briefly across the cabin, taking in details he had not noticed before. The way Naomi had entered without hesitation, the way she had spoken without raising her voice, the way the captain had responded without question. None of it fit into the system he had relied on, and that realization settled into him with a weight that did not demand reaction, only reflection. The captain's voice came again over the intercom, calm and steady, announcing clearance for takeoff, his words measured, precise, but carrying an undertone of alignment that had not been there earlier. The engines responded, their hum rising into a powerful, steady force that vibrated through the floor, through the seats, through every person on board, connecting them all to the same forward motion. Naomi placed her hand lightly against the armrest, fingers relaxed, her breathing slow and even, completely in sync with the moment. She did not look around. She did not seek acknowledgement. She did not need to. Ethan took a small step forward, then stopped, as if the distance between where he stood and where she sat required more than movement to cross. His voice, when it came again, was quiet, controlled, but this time it carried something different, something closer to accountability. "Miss Carter," he said, careful, deliberate. "I should have verified before I acted." The words were simple, but they did not come easily. Naomi turned her head just slightly, enough to acknowledge that he had spoken, but not enough to invite more. Her expression remained calm, but there was a clarity in her eyes that held steady, neither harsh nor forgiving, simply present. "You did verify," she replied, her tone even, unhurried. "You just trusted the wrong things." The statement settled into the space between them, not confrontational, not emotional, but precise in a way that left no room to deflect it. Ethan absorbed it in silence, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition. The aircraft began its acceleration, a smooth, powerful surge that pressed gently against every seat as the runway lights streaked past faster and faster, turning into long lines of gold and white that blurred into motion. The cabin filled with the sound of forward momentum, steady and undeniable. Naomi faced forward again, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened window, unchanged by everything that had just happened. Behind her, Ethan remained where he stood, no longer trying to correct the moment, no longer trying to control it, only standing within it, understanding now that some shifts could not be reversed, only learned from. The nose of the aircraft lifted, smooth and certain, and as the ground fell away beneath them, the silence inside the cabin did not break. It deepened. At 30,000 feet, the world outside disappeared into a deep, endless blue, the horizon no longer a line but a quiet suggestion of distance, and inside the cabin, the earlier tension did not vanish, it settled, like dust after movement, thin but present in every breath. Naomi Carter sat with the same stillness she had carried from the ground, her hands resting gently in her lap, her posture aligned, unshaken, as if the altitude had only made her more grounded, not less. The soft hum of the engines had become constant now, a steady presence that filled the silence without breaking it, a reminder that forward motion did not always need noise. Across the aisle, Ethan Brooks moved with measured steps, attending to routine tasks that once felt automatic, but now required intention, each gesture slower, more aware, as if he were relearning the space he had worked in for years. He adjusted a tray, aligned a glass, checked a latch, but his attention kept returning, not directly, but inevitably, to Naomi. Not to challenge, not to correct, but to understand. A passenger near the front shifted slightly, glancing toward Naomi, then away again, not out of discomfort, but out of a quiet recognition that something significant had unfolded, something that did not need explanation to be felt. The cabin lights reflected softly along the curved walls, creating a warm, controlled environment. But the emotional temperature had changed. It was no longer defined by hierarchy, but by awareness. Naomi leaned her head slightly toward the window, her reflection faint against the darkened glass, her eyes calm, observant, not searching for anything, but seeing everything. The clouds below stretched in endless formations, soft and distant, untouched by what had happened inside the aircraft, and yet somehow mirroring the quiet clarity she carried. Ethan approached again, not with urgency, not with authority, but with purpose shaped by restraint. He stopped beside her row, this time without hesitation, but also without intrusion, his presence careful, respectful. For a moment, he said nothing, allowing the silence to exist between them without forcing it to break. Then, in a voice that carried no command, no assumption, only sincerity, he spoke. "Miss Carter, I misread the situation." The words were simple, but they did not come from procedure, they came from realization. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze fully now, her expression steady, neither cold nor warm, but clear in a way that left no ambiguity. "You read it exactly the way you were trained to," she replied, her tone even, her words measured, not meant to wound, but to reveal. The statement lingered, expanding beyond the moment, touching something deeper than a single interaction. Ethan absorbed it, his posture softening in a way that did not diminish him, but redefined him. He nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of something he had not seen before. The cabin remained still, the low hum of the engines continuing its steady rhythm, and in that rhythm, the space between them no longer held tension, but understanding in its earliest form. Naomi turned back toward the window, her reflection merging again with the sky beyond, unchanged, uninterrupted, and entirely her own. And behind her, the aircraft continued forward, carrying not just its passengers, but the weight of a moment that had quietly, irrevocably shifted something inside it. Time did not feel the same at altitude. Minutes stretched differently, quieter, slower, as if the aircraft had left more than just the ground behind. Naomi Carter remained seated by the window, her gaze resting on the endless sky, but her attention was no longer on the view. It had shifted inward, steady, composed, carrying a calm that did not come from the moment, but from something built long before it. Across the cabin, Ethan Brooks stood near the forward section, reviewing nothing. In particular, his hands lightly resting against the back of a seat, his posture no longer defined by instruction, but by reflection. The routines he once moved through without thought now felt different, each step carrying a question he had never needed to ask before. A flight attendant approached him quietly, leaning in just enough to speak without drawing attention. "Do you want me to continue service as scheduled?" she asked. Ethan paused, not because he did not know the answer, but because for the first time, he considered what that answer meant beyond timing and expectation. He glanced toward Naomi, then back to the attendant. "Yes," he said softly, "but let us be more aware." The words were simple, but they carried a shift that was not part of any training manual. The attendant nodded, sensing the difference without needing it explained, and moved away with a quieter, more deliberate presence. Naomi adjusted slightly in her seat, her hand resting against the armrest, her fingers still, her posture unchanged, but her awareness of the cabin behind her clear. She had felt the shift the moment it began, not in words, but in tone, in movement, in the absence of assumption. A passenger across the aisle finally spoke, his voice low, careful, as if testing the space before committing to it. "I think we all saw something important back there," he said, not directed at anyone in particular, but heard by those who needed to hear it. No one responded immediately, but the statement lingered, not demanding agreement, only acknowledgement. Ethan stepped forward again, this time not toward Naomi, but past her, moving down the aisle with a steadiness that came from understanding rather than authority. He paused near the window across from her, looking out for a brief moment, as if trying to see the same clarity she carried. When he turned back, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. He spoke again, not loudly, not formally, but clearly enough for the cabin to hear. "There are things we rely on because they are familiar," he said, his voice measured. "And sometimes those things are incomplete." The statement was not an announcement. It was a realization spoken out loud. Naomi did not turn to face him, but a small shift in her posture acknowledged that she had heard. The cabin remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of tension or uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that followed truth, steady, grounded, and impossible to ignore once recognized. The engines continued their constant hum, carrying the aircraft forward through open sky, and within that steady motion, something had settled into place, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently, like a line redrawn without needing to be pointed out. And Naomi, still by the window, remained exactly who she had been from the beginning, unchanged, but finally seen in full. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that only comes after something unspoken has been fully understood, not discussed, not debated, just accepted. Naomi Carter remained by the window, her reflection steady against the glass, her presence unchanged, but the space around her no longer carried the same assumptions it once did. Service continued, but it moved differently now, slower, more intentional, each gesture measured as if every action had gained meaning beyond routine. A flight attendant approached Naomi's row, her posture composed but softened, no longer guided by hierarchy, but by awareness. "Miss Carter," she said gently, placing a glass of water on the side table with careful precision. "If there is anything you need, please let me know." The tone was not rehearsed. It was real. Naomi gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, her voice calm when she responded. "Thank you." The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything said before. Across the aisle, Ethan Brooks stood still for a moment longer than necessary, watching the interaction, not with control, but with reflection. Then he moved forward, closing the distance he had once created, stopping beside Naomi's seat with a presence that no longer imposed, but asked. He did not rush his words. He did not rely on formality. "Ms. Carter," he said again, quieter this time, "I owe you more than a correction." The admission hung in the air, not heavy, but clear. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze fully, her expression steady, open, but not inviting anything unnecessary. Ethan continued, his voice grounded in something that had shifted within him. "I allowed a system to define what I should have seen for myself." The words were not perfect, but they were honest. The cabin remained still, the low hum of the engines filling the space between them, carrying the moment forward without interruption. Naomi studied him for a brief second, not judging, not measuring, simply seeing. Then she spoke, her tone unchanged, calm, even, but carrying a quiet strength that did not need to rise. "What matters is what you do after you see it." The statement was not a dismissal, and it was not acceptance. It was something else entirely, something that placed responsibility not in the past, but in what came next. Ethan nodded slowly, the movement small, but meaningful, as if something within him had finally aligned with something outside of him. He stepped back, not retreating, but making space, allowing the moment to settle without forcing it to resolve further. Around them, the cabin continued in quiet motion, a glass placed here, a tray adjusted there, but every action now carried a subtle awareness that had not existed before. Naomi turned back toward the window, her reflection merging once again with the sky beyond, calm, steady, unchanged. The clouds stretched endlessly below, untouched, unaffected, yet somehow echoing the clarity that now filled the space inside the aircraft. And as the jet continued its path through the open sky, the shift that had begun on the ground no longer felt like a moment. It felt like a direction. The aircraft moved steadily through the upper atmosphere, the sky outside now a vast, uninterrupted expanse of soft light and distant horizon, where clouds stretched like quiet oceans beneath them. Inside the cabin, everything had settled into a calm that felt earned, not given, a silence that no longer carried tension, but understanding. Naomi Carter remained seated by the window, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that did not need reinforcement. Her reflection rested against the glass. Steady and clear, as if the moment that had unfolded earlier had only revealed what had always been there. Across the cabin, Ethan Brooks continued his duties, but nothing about them felt automatic anymore. Each movement, each glance, each decision now carried intention, shaped by awareness rather than assumption. He paused briefly near the front, looking back down the aisle, not at Naomi directly, but at the space itself, the space that had shifted, that had corrected something deeper than a simple mistake. A passenger quietly closed a laptop, another leaned back into their seat, and the faint sound of a cup being placed onto a tray echoed softly. Small details that now felt part of something larger, something connected. The captain's voice came over the intercom once more, calm and steady, announcing their cruising altitude and estimated arrival time, his tone unchanged, but the weight behind it now understood differently by those who had been paying attention. Naomi lifted her hand slightly, adjusting the edge of her sleeve, a small, almost unnoticeable motion, but one that carried the same quiet certainty she had held from the very beginning. She did not look around. She did not seek acknowledgement. She did not need to confirm anything. The moment had already spoken for itself. Ethan walked down the aisle one final time, stopping just briefly beside her row, not to correct, not to explain, but simply to exist within the same space without misunderstanding. He did not speak this time. He only nodded once, a gesture that held no formality, no expectation, just recognition. Naomi acknowledged it with the slightest movement of her eyes, nothing more, nothing less. No apology needed to be repeated. No validation needed to be given. The aircraft continued forward, cutting cleanly through the sky, its path steady, uninterrupted. Outside, the sunlight shifted slightly, casting a soft glow across the cabin, reflecting off the window and onto Naomi's face, illuminating it with a quiet warmth that did not demand attention, but held it naturally. And in that light, in that stillness, the truth of the moment settled fully, not in words, not in reactions, but in presence. Naomi Carter had never been out of place. The space had simply needed to learn how to see her. And now, as the aircraft moved toward its destination, the silence inside it carried something rare, something lasting, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood.